So how bad can things get around God's people and yet everything's actually still going to be okay? When I was a young child in school, if somebody in the class got a good telling off, I used to pick it up and feel told off, as if I'd been just as guilty myself. And we can start to feel, perhaps threatened or rebuked or somehow on the back foot as believers, as Christians, in a secular and God-forsaking culture, as if some of it is sticking to me. But what that actually means is that our culture is God-forsaking and possibly God-forsaken, but not that we are. Now, in the book of Esther, we have a story. Stories make a point at length and not briefly, although the point they make is often capable of being briefly stated. And so it is with a story in the first chapter of Esther. We can state it simply and briefly and clearly, but it's longer exposure to that message by putting it in story form that does us the good. What do I mean? Taking time to spell it out gives a chance for the point of the story to go all the way from our heads to our hearts. And that's important because it is our hearts that primarily motivate our will. Now, we've seen on two previous occasions that the story of Esther has this big central theme that when God seems to be completely absent, he's still working in the background to fulfill his plan and purposes in, through, and for his people. But as I've said, the message gets across to us better, more lastingly, more life-changingly in story form because a story exposes us to the message both over a longer period of time and using a wider bandwidth in our brains than simply telling us the message the way I just did in that simple sentence I used just now back there. What did I say in that simple sentence back there? Can you remember what or whether I actually said anything back there about the point of this chapter? Well, not so easily as if it was told you in a more dynamic and more leisurely way in the story of this book of Esther. What we need to keep in mind is the overall message of the book as we drill down into the story, giving it 8 or 9 weeks or so to seep down into us and change us as it does so from the inside out as we work steadily in a more leisurely way through the various scenarios in this book that flesh out the message and demonstrate the point that God is making through the human author in this book. So we start that today with Esther 1. What are we exposed to in Esther 1? Well, firstly, we're exposed to a powerful and a dangerous king in verses 1 to 8. It's quite a picture that's getting painted for us. This is what happened during the time of Xerxes, the Xerxes who ruled over 127 provinces, stretching from India to Kush. At that time, King Xerxes reigned from his royal throne in the citadel of Susa. And in the 3rd year of his reign, he gave a banquet for all his nobles and officials. The military leaders of Persia and Media, the princes and the nobles of the provinces were present. For a full 180 days, he displayed the vast wealth of his kingdom and the splendor and glory of his majesty. And when those days were over, the king gave a banquet lasting 7 days in the enclosed garden of the king's palace, for all the people from the least to the greatest who were in the citadel of Susa. The garden had hangings of white and blue linen, fastened with cords of white linen and purple material to silver rings on marble pillars. There were couches of gold and silver on a mosaic pavement of porphyry, marble, mother of pearl, and other costly stones. And wine was served in goblets of gold, each one different from the other. And the royal wine was abundant, in keeping with the king's liberality. By the king's command, each guest was allowed to drink without restriction, for the king instructed all the wine stewards to serve each man whatever he wished. So there's a picture for you there then of what we call absolute human power, exercised in the country where the people of God were in exile, and we're going to see it's not being exercised by a very nice man. But he's the one with all the riches, all the power, all the authority, and he seems to be the one getting the glory. So it all appears. Now look at that little passage I read you from verses 1 to 8 of chapter 1. This story is being presented to us here as history. From the very start, verse 1. We need to be aware what we're being told here claims to be history. This is what happened, says Esther 1:1. Now, the language that's used there to say this is what happened is a formula. It's found in other historical books in the Old Testament, like Joshua and Judges and the 2 Samuels. However stylized the writing becomes in the rest of the book, the author from the outset wants us to think of these events as having happened. So, these events occurred during the reign of a Persian king, King Xerxes, who reigned from 486 to 465 BC. He's the son and he's the successor of King Darius, who was the benefactor of the rebuilding of the Jerusalem temple, which we read about in Haggai chapter 2 and in Zechariah chapters 7 and 8. Xerxes also pops up in Ezra 4:6 as the reigning king when those people who opposed the rebuilding of the temple in Jerusalem brought him their objections to it and tried to stir things up against the Jewish rebuilders. We're being told it's a history and it's got a historical setting. But secondly, there's a hint we're being told that this historical king is a bit of a headache. It's an interesting fact that while Xerxes is the Greek transliteration of this guy's Persian name, in Hebrew, his name takes the form Ahasuerus, Ashaswerosh in Hebrew. But that name has no literal meaning in Hebrew. But when you pronounced it out loud, well, it sounds something like the Hebrew for king headache. And so he was to God's people, as well as to all the other subjects of his empire. It's telling us this chapter then about the power of the headache king. It talks about the scale of his empire. Xerxes was known for consolidating the Persian Empire from India to Kush, that is, from modern Pakistan to northern Sudan. The tale this book tells is centered on Susa, one of the 4 capital cities from which the Persian monarchs ruled, where the royal court spent the winter, in fact. The place was far too hot in the summer, so they used it in the winter. But the point is, the empire Xerxes ruled was so big it had 4 capital cities, as it were, to choose from. An empire on some scale. Now, historically, in 483 BC, Xerxes held a great war council, and we read about it in verses 4 to 5. The scale and might and splendor is all on display, chapter 1, verse 3, in the big banquet recorded here as taking place in that 3rd year of Xerxes' reign. And the dating corresponds to the Great War Council of 483 BC, held to plan the Persian invasion of Greece. So, in the big feast that we read about in these verses, our headache king is basically getting together with the nobles, officials, military leaders, princes and governors to garner support for his invasion of the Greeks. Now, the empire he's ruling over is vast, stretching from modern Pakistan in the east to modern Turkey in the west. Many different languages, people groups and religions all included in the mix and maintaining their loyalty and support for a project like the invasion of Greece. It was going to be no small task. During the 180 days of this war council, Xerxes displayed his wealth and his splendor to consolidate the support of the leaders of these diverse groups scattered across the empire, gaining their loyalty to his cause. Are you getting the picture for the events that are going to take place? Now you can read about the history of all of that in the Greek historian Herodotus, 7-8. So Xerxes is putting on a big show to establish as a certainty that he was able to reward those who would rally to him and support his campaign into Greece, the Persian Wars. 7-day banquet is opened up to all the residents of Susa, from the least to the greatest, we're told, to bring the 6 months of festivities that had been going on there to get all this support from these people for this invasion of Greece, to bring it all to a head, chapter 1, verses 4 to 5. And it's described here for us as a cracker of a show. The sumptuousness of the banquet is just painted out for us in this story in verses 6 and 7. Focuses on the abundance of wine, in fact, in keeping with the king's liberality, served in goblets of gold, each one different from the other. And the opulence of setting, Persia's wealth and magnificence. Well, it's something that dazzled Alexander the Great when he entered the palace at Susa more than a century later. When Alexander came in, he found there 40,000 talents of gold and silver bullion. It's about 1,200 tons, as well as about 270 tons of minted coins. all of which had been accumulated by the Persian kings, Xerxes amongst them. Well, basically, that banquet was there to display the wealth and might of King Xerxes, to show his ability to handsomely reward those who would loyally support his campaign to conquer Greece under his command. That's what's going on. Now, funnily enough, and this serves the purpose of the book, really, the original readers of this chapter would know that Xerxes was defeated at Hellespont, the Battle of Hellespont, after a 4-year campaign in Greece, and all this wealth was severely depleted at that point. It's a bit of a turnaround. It's a bit of a, you're showing off now, but we know what's coming down the track. But the author of Esther doesn't spell that out. Simply majors on the splendour and positivity of the earlier days, which all the readers are aware had been dramatically reversed later. The author simply wants the readers to reflect at this point on the extent to which God's people were living through, challenging times under the powerful boot of a pagan king, and they were suffering the penalty of the covenant they'd broken. For example, 1 Kings 9, 6-9 talks about that. Now, name whichever empire, nation, or government you like, whatever the extent of their power to pressurize God's people, the King of the universe still sits on his highly exalted heavenly throne, laughing at the impotence of even the greatest of nations. And Psalm 2 reflects that for us. Psalm 2 verses 4-6. The one enthroned in heaven laughs. The Lord scoffs at them. He rebukes them in his anger, terrifies them in his wrath, saying, I have installed my king on Zion, my holy mountain. Oh yeah, the people of God can be living in times when it looks as if, the godless have triumphed and they have all this power and authority, but he alone is the King of Kings. And yet it isn't always going to feel like that for the people of God. And it is of a time in which it certainly doesn't feel like that our author writes. As Karen Jobes puts it, to be in Christ is to be on the winning side of history. To be victors even in the face of life's greatest threats. That is true. That is true. But it can be hard in adverse circumstances when the mighty are godless to live as a victor and not as a victim. And this book is written to help us at that specific point. It's precisely one of those times of tangible great threat that the people of God were living through in Esther 1 in the times that we are reading about here. How bad can things get? How mighty and powerful can the godless be, and yet God still be on his throne? Well, verses 9-12, things are about to get a bit even more pressurizing. Because in Esther 1, 9-12, we meet the queen who wouldn't compromise her integrity. Esther 1, 9. The banquet is going on. You see, Xerxes is throwing his big thing to win all these people over and get them on side so they'll go with him and invade Greece. Verse 9, Queen Vashti also gave a banquet for the women in the royal palace of King Xerxes. On the 7th day, when King Xerxes was in high spirits from wine, he commanded the 7 eunuchs who served him, Mehuman, Biztha, Harbona, Bigtha, Abagtha, Zethar, and Carcass, to bring before him Queen Vashti, wearing her royal crown, in order to display her beauty to the people and nobles, for she was lovely to look at. But when the attendants delivered the king's command, Queen Vashti refused to come. And then the king became furious and burned with anger. Oh, Vashti. Vashti, the beautiful woman. We don't know a lot about Vashti. Herodotus, the Greek guy who wrote about the Persian wars that are coming up and that Xerxes is just now preparing for. Herodotus, who is a Greek historian but was sometimes wrong, he doesn't mention Vashti as the name of Xerxes' queen, but does name Xerxes' queen as Amestris. But it has been suggested that Vashti sounds similar to the Old Persian for beautiful woman. So it seems at least possible that a stylized name for the queen is being used by our author here. We're being told, it's being highlighted for us that this is a beautiful woman. And it's beauty and the pleasure of the eye that's very much in the frame as this little bit works out. Well, there's a beautiful queen, but there's also a power play beauty pageant being planned. You see, after 7 days of hard drinking at this banquet, where anyone could drink as much as they liked of whatever they liked, Xerxes, described in the text as being in high spirits from wine, Xerxes sent for his queen to display her beauty before the men of Susa. Bear in mind, the king's trying to secure the support of his empire as he goes to war against the Greeks, as he's planning that campaign. He was displaying the vast wealth of his kingdom and the splendour and glory of his majesty, verse 4 tells us. And in order to do so, he sent for the beautiful Vashti, wearing the royal diadem he'd given her, because she was a living trophy of his power and glory. He sent 7 eunuchs to fetch her. Why? Probably because that was enough to carry her seated on her royal litter into the assembly hall to emphasize the great majesty and beauty of his trophy bride. You've got to set that in the drink-soaked context of this account. Now, there's something important to know here about Persian drinking culture if we're going to understand what's going on. It's clear from this story in Esther 1 that we are to understand that prodigious quantities of alcohol had been consumed at this war council come feast that's being described for us. Our old friend Herodotus, the Greek historian again, helps us to understand the situation by pointing out that Persians seriously drank as they deliberated matters of state. So Esther 3:15 describes Haman sitting down with Xerxes to discuss executing the decree against the Jews, not by going into Xerxes' study, getting maps out or something, but it says, the courtiers went out hurriedly by order of the king, and the decree was issued in Susa the citadel. And the king and Haman sat down to drink. But the city of Susa was thrown into confusion. See, the ancients thought that intoxication put them in closer touch with the spirit world, and thereby with the greater wisdom that he could give them. Seems bizarre, but it is how they conducted themselves in that time and culture when matters of state were to be discussed. Well, Vashti wasn't having any of this, and it leads to diplomatic and political embarrassment. So now we know what Xerxes was doing at this time. It's not just a Beano, there's something going on. And we know something more about the extent he's gone to solidify his noble support as he goes to war with Greece. So in that context, we can see that the refusal of his own queen to obey his command precipitates an extremely embarrassing crisis. He's trying to persuade these nobles to support his war and come under his command as he goes off to war with them, and use his queen telling him no, publicly. Xerxes was understandably furious. We're told he burned with anger. He needed all these diverse leaders to obey his command as they went to war, but here in his own palace he couldn't get his own wife to obey him. Now, it must be obvious the point is not concerned with the evils of alcohol here. The point is that the Persian court was not a safe place, because Xerxes held great power and he wielded it unpredictably, making decisions from dubious motives with impaired judgment. We're being shown the dangers of living under Xerxes' power in the Persian Empire. An alarming backdrop to the major conflict that breaks over the heads of God's people when the power of this Persian Empire gets turned against God's people later. But the question for us is this: just how bad can it get for the living situation of God's people and for God to still be on the throne? Pretty bad, so it appears. Pretty much worse than things have become yet in this story. But there's more coming down the track. What happens next in the salutary tale of Vashti is that the powerful abuse their power to punish her principled disobedience. The powerful punish principled disobedience. You get that in verses 13 to 22. Well, the king, it's usual for him to consult experts in matters of law and justice, and he speaks with his wise men. 7 nobles of Persia who had special access to the king were highest in the kingdom. They didn't need permission to come into his presence. They could just come without comment, without invitation. According to law, what must be done to Queen Vashti? He asked them. She has not obeyed the command of King Xerxes that the eunuchs have taken to her. And then one of them, Memucan, speaks up in the presence of the king and the nobles. This is all taking place in public. Memucan says Queen Vashti has done wrong, not only against the king, but also against all the nobles and the peoples of all the provinces of King Xerxes, because she's setting a bad example. It's going to lead to all the husbands despising their wives when they hear about what's happened. There'll be no end, they say, of disrespect and discord. So, make a decree, they say. Let it be written in the laws of Persia and Media, which cannot be repealed, that Vashti is never again to enter the presence of King Xerxes and get a replacement in her place. So all the women all across the realm will respect their husbands, whether they're small or great, lowly or great. Well, they were all very happy with the advice. And so he, that is Xerxes, sent dispatches to all parts of the kingdom, to each province in its own script, and to each people in their own language. That's all going to be important. Proclaiming that every man should be ruler over his own household, using his native tongue. You see, there's been this huge public defiance from his queen, while he's trying to show the assembly what a big cheese he is, and the prospects for his campaign to conquer Greece are very much tied up in this matter. So he summons his closest advisors. The Hebrew calls them literally the 7 who see the face of the king. They can come unannounced and uninvited, you see, into his presence. And they're described as men who knew the times. That is, they used astrology and divination to work out what you should do. You can see what godless hands the people of the Persian Empire had fallen into. And God's people were amongst them. We're told that Xerxes, this great ruler over the land, was in the habit of consulting these occult practitioners in matters of law and justice. And calling them in to do their thing shows how outlandish Vashti's actions were deemed to be. There was no legal precedent for defying the king, so the diviners had to be brought in. And what did they come up with? Firstly, exclusion from influence. As Vashti had refused to come to the king, she would be refused access to the king. She is demoted to the status of a person who is not allowed to come into the presence of the king. Verse 19, she's stripped of her position by royal decree, and for the first time the book starts referring to her as Vashti, not Queen Vashti. Now the effect of that on Vashti can only be imagined. And this is a story, a narrative, a type of literature that employs the imagination to garner understanding. So imagine is what we're very much expected to do. Imagine what it would be like for her. I don't know if you saw this on the main evening news a couple of weeks back, but a British politician discussing the future of a large number of Tory MPs in seats that had been won at the last election. In the light of the turmoil in Westminster, he said recently on that national evening news programme, there is nothing so X as an ex-MP. Well, here was Vashti. 1 minute hosting an elaborate banquet for the women who had the ear of the highest rulers of the Persian Empire, and next, an X. An X in oh so many ways. We just aren't told how or where or by what means she will now live. She's out. And this king is not known for his compassionate treatment of those who've annoyed him. No hope for the future for her either. How so? Well, secondly, this royal decree against Vashti is to be written into the laws of Persia and Media, verse 19, which cannot be repealed. Cannot be repealed that Vashti is never again to enter the presence of King Xerxes. And also Let the king, they said, give her royal position to someone else who is better than she. You see? Legally irreversible, and should we say relationally irreversible, because the recommendation of the seven, led by Memucan, goes on from making a legal recommendation to suggesting the reorganization of the affairs of Xerxes' bedchamber. Replace this broken old queen with a new one, they suggest. Now, he's asking their advice and he's the king, but when I say suggest, this whole thing is being played out in public. And the prospective allies of the king in his campaign against Greece are all watching and forming opinions. So the hands of the king are actually well and truly tied. But Memucan hasn't finished yet. He's on a roll and he's enjoying the moment. He plays on the paranoia of potentates. This is the thing about the limits of human, as it's described, human absolute power. Verse 16, Memucan replied in the presence of the king and the nobles, Queen Vashti's done wrong not only against the king, but also against all the nobles and the peoples of all the provinces of King Xerxes. Ooh, this is going public. For the queen's conduct will become known to all the women, so they'll despise their husbands and say King Xerxes commanded Queen Vashti to be brought before him, but she would not come. This very day the Persian and Median women of the nobility who have heard about the queen's conduct will respond to all the king's nobles in the same way. There will be no end of disrespect and discord. What's happened here, in their folly really, is that what started as a tiff between husband and wife gets escalated into a crisis of empire and society. Memucan universalizes the incident, expressing his personal anxieties and fears for the impact of Vashti's conduct on the most fundamental building blocks of their Persian society right across the empire. Vashti is being given such influence by her actions that when they hear of what she's done, women right across the empire, it's said, will act up the same way she did, starting with the wives of the seven advisors. So the advice is that when women across the empire see the harsh consequences that are meted out to Vashti, they will be intimidated into respecting their husbands from the greatest to the dumbest, verse 20. See, with arguments like this being made, the impotence of those who act as if they are impotent gets highlighted. Xerxes is being externally manipulated. He's a puppet to the people he's the tyrant over. The advice has to be taken up. And again, that is ironic, if not laughable. But it gets worse, because they ironically then publish the insecurity of the king. The decree is issued, and it's to be published right across the Roman Empire and every part of the empire in the local languages of every province. What have they published? They've published their own marital anxiety. And Xerxes has commanded right across the empire what he himself could not accomplish in his own palace, verse 20, that every man should be ruler over his own household. The futility of human absolutism, its powerlessness, is being parodied here in view of the potent sovereignty of the King of Kings. But that theme is going to be played out right across the face of this book. Okay, conclusion. There's no doubt about it. This account in Esther 1 reassures us that the people of God can live through difficult and dangerous times in godless and threatening places when power is exercised by wicked people as if absolute power were theirs and not God's. God's people can live through that. And already in this account, the cracks and the limitations of Xerxes the godless and tyrannical ruler are being highlighted and parodied as the story unfolds, being shown once more, if we needed it, that absolute power seized by the hands of the godless and wicked tends to show corrupted human nature up for what it is. We're being shown here the abuse of power in marital relationships as the consequence of fallen human nature, and in the state as well. We're having demonstrated to us the contrast between the use humanity makes of seized power with the way power was exercised amongst us, certainly by Jesus Christ, the omnipotent, incarnate God the Son. But above all, we're having demonstrated to us in the context of this book the way God's people can live in terrible times and still be all right. So for ourselves, we should not panic when we see the news on the TV or hear it on the radio of an evening. Because as Esther shows us, humans seize power but cannot hold it. in the face of the omnipotence of God, who undertakes for even his exiled and alienated people, like those living in the citadel of Susa at that time. So that even the mighty that seem most powerful and tyrannical in this first chapter, the holes in their power and authority are very evident. Why can God's people live in terrible times and still be all right and find peace? Because as Esther 1 shows us, the tyrants aren't in control. But the God who isn't shouting loudly in this book, nevertheless, rules over all. Next time we see how much worse things can get for God's people themselves, and what surprising things God can do to untangle mess.